Okay, so let's quickly review where we've been. We just talked about issues of inequality versus inequity, and we started with a statement by Dr. King saying of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. So he starts off by calling it an inequality, stating that there are differences in healthcare for certain groups, and then he gives it the moral stance of it is an injustice. In the US, we largely have this concept that it is an injustice that health and healthcare are human rights. But it's still difficult to pursue, because how do we define healthcare? Is this something that is just a basic preventive service like your general family practice, prenatal care, or are we talking here about any form of surgery that you might need, or plastic surgery? Where do we draw the line as far as health and determinants of health and what we need to be healthy and happy and to pursue life, liberty, and happiness? This is an interesting question, often debated by insurance companies and by the U.S. public in general, as far as what is that health care that we need to provide. So, okay, we have the sense it is to some degree a human right that we are going to pursue in the U.S. for all people, but what is that level of care that we're aiming for? And we also talked about that it's not just a matter of health care, that there's these other determinants of health, social issues, environmental issues, and then individual behavioral issues that all contribute, are all factors or determinants in an individual and in a community's health outcome. So which of those are areas that are the biggest blocks or preventers for different populations seeking health care and pursuing better health outcomes? So moving on, as we talked about health disparity data, one of the best ways to get a broad glimpse of that is by looking at life expectancy overall. And so what we see here is life expectancy at birth for the U.S. This is the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention data from 1900 to 2010. What we see here in 1900 for both races, so we'll look at white and black in a second, and we'll look at male and female, both genders, but combined we were at 47.3 in 1900. In 2010 we were up to almost 79 years on average. So we've made huge improvements in the past 110 years, and as you know, mostly attributable to public health and the improvements we've made for the public as a whole. But if we break those numbers down by gender first, so we see here the difference between male and female in general, females tend to live longer. And if we break that down by white and black racial categories, we see big differences again in life expectancy. So overall for white it's at almost 79, and for black or African American it's at 75. So African Americans on average live 4 years less than your average white person. And so this is something where we see this has to be an injustice, right, is the general sense. There's differences in the social determinants, there's differences in access and quality of care. These are the theories that we're working with that to a large degree have been shown in the data. So the understanding that we want to pursue is why that is. But we see from this table very clearly the importance of data and the importance of good data. If we didn't collect data on black or African Americans versus white, if we didn't have racial categories, if we didn't have age or gender categories, we wouldn't be able to see this. This table shows a summary of that data starting here where we were in 1900. Let's move back 50 years. This was one of the earliest U.S. censuses. This is for Massachusetts only. And we see even lower life expectancy. So we were both male and female right around 40 years. So we made huge improvements in those 50 years and then even since then. So really low life expectancy back in the 1850s. But what we see here is this gap, this missing data on black males and females. We don't see any data for that. So again, we don't know what we don't measure. So the importance of having good data is to be able to even see where this is, because then we come in the 1900s and we see that gap between 32, 33, and 46 and 48. The question is, what were black or African Americans at here? did they just not improve, or did they improve as well, but then they were even lower? And so there are some estimates of what the African American life expectancy was at that point. But the reality is we didn't measure to the same extent that we did for the white population. So without the data, we don't even know what the difference is. It could be assumed, oh yeah, all people are the same, all people get the same health care. But when we take the measurements, we see, no, it's not true. So that was measurements with the variables of both gender and race. Now, race is this very interesting concept that's had a huge effect throughout history. And so we want to dive into that a bit more, as well as concepts of ethnicity and nationality and how that affects health and how we use them as variables to measure health outcomes. So on this map, this is a map from the 1890s of basic ethnographic or race groups throughout the world. This map was produced in Germany, so this was their understanding at the time. And you see these three main groups. So they have 1, 2, 3, which translate as Caucasian, Mongoloid, and Negroid. So essentially white, yellow, and black is what that translates to. And you see that in the colors that you see here. So we see this Negroid group in sub-Saharan Africa. We have what is currently considered the Caucasian group, and this is to this day how it is labeled within the US, where you have any descendants of Europe, North Africa, and parts of the Middle East are all considered Caucasian. And then we have this really huge group, which at the time was all considered Mongoloid or yellow. So at this point, we have these three major race groups. That is largely how a good portion of the world, at least Europe and the Western world, according to this data, saw how races were constructed, that there are these three distinct groups of people and some variation within them. So we see the variation here, of course, but largely, this kind of groups a whole lot of people together and then makes these distinct lines between the different groups. Where does this come from? A lot of it comes from a Judeo-Christian perspective from the Bible or the Torah, where we have the story of Noah and the flood. And he has these three sons, and after the flood, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, after the Tower of Babel, and God comes down and confuses the languages because they were building a name for themselves rather than honoring God. So he confuses their languages, which causes them to scatter. They don't understand each other. So in this graphic here, what we see is the understanding of where the descendants of each of the sons went. It was generally understood that the sons of Ham moved down into Africa, that the sons of Shem were here at that time in the Persian Gulf and the Saudi Arabia area, and then the sons of Japheth were up here in both Europe and Asia at that time. Now these groups moved over time, but essentially what was understood and believed is that the descendants of Ham is where we get a Negroid race. The descendants of Shem are here where we get the Caucasian race that they later moved into Europe. And the descendants of Japheth that were here in this Asian area became the ancestors of the Mongoloid race. And so we see this perception that has persisted through a large portion of history of where these three races came from and why they should be considered distinct groups. Now, whether this also shows some of the biblical account and the sons of where that concept comes from. But even if that was the origins, and you're allowed to have different perspectives on that, but even if it came from these three distinct groups, we still don't see clear lines between the groups. So this map that you see, this was by Luigi Luca Cavalli Sforza. So he is an Italian scientist that is looking at the human genome across the world and trying to see, is there this genetic basis for race? Are there essentially three main groups of people in the world, or what are the main groups of people in the world, and how would we draw those borders? So we see some similarities where we do have, as you can observe with your eyes, we do have overall, we have these different groups here in sub-Saharan Africa, Europe and North Africa, and parts of the Middle East again. And then we have Asia and the Americas, but there's more difference, I think, shown in this map between the groups. And then the original inhabitants of Australia and the islands being their own distinct racial group. So what he showed is by the human genome where the distinctions lie, who is most similar to each other. And so from this, he argued that this shows the migration patterns of humans throughout history, that starting in one central location, this is, and I believe his hypothesis is starting in Africa, that then humans, as they migrated across the earth, that as groups stayed over time and other groups moved on, these were the population kind of pockets that remained and over time became genetically distinct from one another. But also over time, as people groups moved, they migrated, wars happened, there was intermarrying. And so there is a greater, this shows the gradient, I think, a bit more clearly, and it is essentially a gradient between groups. Now, a lot of researchers really argue against any genetic basis to race. They say there is no differences between groups, that there's more differences within groups than between groups, the genetic variability. And so race cannot be defined by your genes. And a large portion of the researchers in the US, I would say, follow this train of thought, this argument. But whether there's a genetic basis or not, race is definitely a social category, that based on your overall appearance, eye color, hair color, skin color, that you are grouped into categories, and people often view those categories, and those categories have consequences. But again, it's pretty blurry. So how does a general understanding of race right now that you would find on like dictionary.com, which really just shows modern current thought, is it's these major divisions of humankind having distinct physical characteristics. So this is where, based on your phenotype, you're kind of grouped. But other definitions do include these other categories of both geography and genetics. So the second one says a local, geographic, or global human population distinguished as more or less a distinct group by genetically transmitted physical characteristics. So they're stressing different points, and so it's not universal. It's not a universal understanding of what race is. Another way to help you understand why this is mainly just a social construct is looking at how race is defined or measured over time. So this chart shows the U.S. policy for assigning race on your birth certificate prior to 1989. And when we look at the first few, we kind of get the sense that, oh, it's whatever the mother is, that's what the child would be defined as. But then we get down here and we say, oh no, the mother here is white, but the father's black, so therefore the child is black. So here we see pretty much not a matter of whether it's the father or the mother, but more color trumping less color. So the more color you have, that's what you're more likely to be assigned to as a child. So black taking the preference in each of these. And then slight distinction here. When it's a Japanese father, so in this case we had black and Japanese and the child was black. In this case we have Japanese and black and the child is Japanese. So in this case the argument is, well, even though one of the parent is black and they may have more color than your typical Japanese person, because they have an Asian last name, because they come from an Asian family, they may overall be treated as your average Asian American, that they may grow up with the same social standing, average, income or education levels, distinct from black groups, and so therefore their overall health outcomes would be closer to that of your average Japanese American than they would your average African American or black person. And so we see that these are really kind of these arbitrary categories. There's some sense to them. And they're not, the reasoning behind them, they aren't all bad. They aren't all meant to be prejudice or discriminatory, though they were often used that way, obviously. But part of it is because if somebody has one white parent and one parent of color, whether black or Japanese, more color, I don't want to say white people don't have color, But if they do express those phenotypes, if they are overall darker skin, throughout history, unfortunately this has proven to be true, that they are going to be treated differently, and therefore they need to be categorized as Black so that we capture the data of that group. And so we know if that's going to be their overall association, public association, that we include them in that group to get the overall health status of that group. So, there's some argument there of why to do it that way, but overall we see it's a social construct that doesn't have always clear rules. And we're going to see next how that changes by location and by time. Currently in the U.S., the policy is that the mother gets to choose the ethnicity of the child, or the parents do, but specifically the mother. They get to self-select their race and ethnicity, and they get to choose that for their child. So let's look at a different location. What is it in Japan? How does the policy work? So here we see in the first two cases that whether or not you have a Japanese mother or a white or a Black mother, the race of the child is selected by the race of the father. So this was the rule up to 1983, so this is a different kind of system. It's easier than to pick which one to go with. It's a simpler rule, but unfortunately then it does lose a lot of data as far as, is this really representative of the ethnicities that are present in the population, or the races that are present, and even the phenotypes that are seen. This child is likely not to look just white or just Black or even just Japanese in any of these. And so that's the difficulty of the policy as it was. And countries have faced that and had to change their policies because of it. In Brazil, we see a different approach. Instead of picking the father or the mother, or at that point using the mother's or either preference, self-selecting, we have this new category. And so in Brazil, we use the term mulatto. So whether or not it's the father or mother, if it's one is white and one is Black, then we have this mulatto category. Now in the U.S., we have something similar where we can indicate that we are multiracial or more than one race. But for most of U.S. history, this was not an option. So this is only recently that we've kind of conceded to the fact that there are some people that really don't fit in either category and don't want to be put in either category. But what does it mean to be multiracial? What are the health outcomes for those groups? This is a new set of data, and so we don't really have a good picture of that yet. So the definition of race, or how we're going to look at race, is largely around this social construct. Thomas Leviste, who is a leading researcher in health disparities, specifically for African American populations, in his textbook Minority Populations in Health, he says that while there is no biological basis for race, races are social categories that have an important impact on people's lives and health as well. Human variation does not conform to categories. However, categories are all we have to work with. So he is for the argument of still measuring race, but agrees that these categories change over time as the population changes. There isn't a biological basis that ties the term, that ties groups to certain categories. Many would argue why even have racial categories? Doesn't this just perpetuate the problem? It brings this race consciousness into everything. But again, if you think of that 1850 to 1900 data, when we didn't have data specific for African American populations, or even if we did collect the data but it was all lumped into one general US average, like currently, we would lose that difference, where currently there is still the 4 years of difference in life expectancy between white and Black. And so there's definitely arguments on either side. If you would love to discuss that further, we'll create a discussion board around that. Leave me a comment or send me an email, and we'll do that, because that's a great discussion to have, and it's not one that's finished. It's something that's ongoing in the U.S. So that was variation by time, but let's look again how these categories, even just the social constructs of them, have changed in the U.S. over the past 100 or 200 years. So here we see in the beginning, in the 1790s, the categories were free white males and free white females. Then they had all other free persons, regardless of background, origin, and then slaves. And so these were the 4 categories that you could fall into. Moving on to the 1820s, we see this new category of all other free persons except Indians not taxed. So in this case, American Indians who were living in the same region as the U.S. states that were forming, some opted to join the states and pay taxes, and so these were counted in the census, but obviously they wanted to make that clear distinction that if you don't pay taxes, you're not counted in the census. This was still kind of, you know, there's the frontier lands and everything at this point, and so it was harder to categorize. As things move on, we lose the gender. We don't include gender and race. We make those separate categories now, which makes things easier. So you can see gender for each of those groups, be it free-colored or slaves. But going on into the 1850s, then what we have is black and mulatto. What does that mean? Did they not measure white? No, it's just assumed you were white, and this was sort of an opt-out box where you're saying, like, no, I'm not white, I'm black or mulatto. But those were the only two categories that you could be other than white at that point. By the 1880s, we had so much immigration from new sources, not just Europe and Africa, but through the slave trade as it had been, but now immigration from the Asian countries, so from China and and we see this reflected on the census, but we're also now counting Indians as their own racial category. In the 1890s, we see an interesting terms. You probably have never seen some of these before. We have white, black, mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, then Chinese, Japanese, and Indian. What on earth are those? So mulatto obviously is if you are kind of half and half, white and black. A quadroon is saying that you are 1/4. And an octoroon is saying that you are 1/8. And this is where we have these policies. Even if you were up to 1/8 black, they wanted that counted. And so it created this category, octoroon, that you could be on the census. By 1900, that was gone. You were either white or black, again. And then Chinese, Japanese were the largest immigration groups, and then Indian. This stayed. In 1920, we added the other category, and then in 1930, that other category exploded. So now we have Mexican, Filipino, Hindu, and Korean as some of the largest immigration groups in the years prior to that. In 1960, sorry, that's supposed to be white, and then Negro, and that's an interesting change that happened too, the change between black to Negro in the 1920 to 1930. Black was actually seen as more derogatory, and Negro was more formal or respectable at that time. But then after a while, Negro being used eventually so we see in the 60s, that switched back to black being the more appropriate or respectful term. So again, terms change over time. By 1980s, they had all of these different categories. And these are interesting because, again, this is supposed to be race, like these broad groups. And yet what we see here really are nationality. So we see the confusion in definition. Are we talking about an overall larger grouping of population? Or are we talking about nationality? Are we talking about ethnicity? And these terms are still getting sorted out in the U.S., and we can look at what they are currently. So the U.S. government recognized that this was a major issue as far as what people prefer to be called, and so they did a survey. Rather than just assign terms that may or may not be derogatory, they polled the U.S. population and asked what they preferred. So this was a 1996 poll of the U.S. population, and at that point, Hispanic was the preferred term over Latino or of Spanish origin, but they're all over 10%, so you will often see all three. You can check a box if you are either Hispanic, Latino, or of Spanish origin. For white, white was definitely preferred over Caucasian. You will still sometimes see both, but you will definitely not see European American or Anglo anymore. For black, this one is rather split depending on where you come from. So black almost had half, but also had a large preference for African American and Afro-American. Negro was no longer the preferred term or colored, and so usually you will see black and or African American, you won't see Afro-American. For American Indian, The preferred term as of 1996 was American Indian, but closely behind that was Native American. And so you will see both terms used synonymously depending on where you are in the U.S. And this is one of those hot topics too that people will correct you on either way, but really it all depends on where you come from. But either term is technically appropriate according to the U.S. government. If you want to play it safe, according to this, American Indian is slightly more popular. And then for the multiracial category, we have multiracial and mixed race being the top preferences, but a good 28% there had no preference. And so this term really is still being defined. It's almost too new to really have a strong preference for either way. And so we'll see over time whether multiracial or mixed race ends up being the most popular one. Probably multiracial is how it looks right now. But again, this is going to continue to change as the population changes. So this is something we have to measure over time, because often the government is trying to be reflective of the social categories that are out there, not that they are determining them, but it's kind of this feedback loop, both the government input and the social input on how we define our racial categories. So as I said, according to those terms, here's how you will see it on the U.S. Census. So number 6 here is, what is this person's race? So you have white, Black, African American, or Negro. Interesting, they still did put Negro. Then American Indian, and then also Alaskan Native was a distinction there. And then they have all these, other specific groups. But what they also have is some other race in print, and so the U.S. population kind of gets to define what we view as our races. Now, interesting, this is the race and ethnicity section. So again, this is the race and ethnicity section. So we see here how ethnicity is considered something different. And specifically, we're looking at Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin. And we can also indicate whether it's Mexican, Mexican-American, Chicano, Puerto Rican, or Cuban, or some other Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin. So we'll get into this in a moment on why this is distinct from race. Let's go into these 3 terms. So we've talked about race. Now let's go into ethnicity and nationality, and what do we mean by those? Nationality is a pretty easy one to define for the most part. It has to do with what's on your birth certificate or your passport, who issued your birth certificate, or what is on your passport. So what nation are you a citizen of? However, this doesn't work very well for a lot of people. If you see this map of Europe over time, between 1918 and 1930, we see all of this change in Eastern Europe as far as how countries were labeled. All of Ukraine did not exist at that time. Yugoslavia did not exist. We have the Austria-Hungary Empire here still. We have Austria-Hungary here, which obviously broke up. And then the Ottoman Empire, which became Turkey, Syria, Palestine, and Transjordan, as it was called at that time. So after World War I, we see this reshuffling of nations. So if you were Serbian before World War I, what are you after? Are you Yugoslavian? If that may be how nations would define you, is that the only way to define it? Do we get to self-identify our nationality? So what happens over time, and what happens for populations who may be living within a certain area but aren't necessarily claimed by that country? That happens all of the time. So this is a fun map if you want to look at more time slots. Down here, the nationalarchives.gov.uk, they have these available, and they're fun. You can look anywhere in the world and look at different time slots. Here's the difference between World War I and World War II in Southeast Asia, and the major changes between what was Siam to now Thailand, and what over here was Burma, which was part of the Indian Empire, and the British Empire that covered India and Burma, but now it was broken up into all these countries. And again, remember, at that time we had Eastern Pakistan, because Pakistan was broken up into the 2 sides. So major changes. How do you really define nationality? It seems simple, but it's not. Ethnicity gets even more complicated. To understand this concept of ethnicity, we get to look at the anthropological perspective and how it's defined there. And ethnicity is this, as it says here, this ethnic identity that's forged in a particular place and time. So it's something that is created almost by us over certain events, certain points in history. It's created, it changes over time. It's not something that we can just define by the place that we were born in necessarily, or by our phenotype, by our features. So there's 6 main things that bind together this concept of ethnicity. It's saying that there is a common proper name to identify the group. So Hispanic is a term that is used to define an ethnic group. So they consider themselves to a degree a group, and so they have a name to identify that. There's a common myth. There's a myth of common ancestry, of time and place and origin. This is where you can have an ethnic group like the Hmong, who have this common ancestry over time, and they transcend national borders. They're in China, they're in Thailand, they're in several Southeast Asian countries, in Vietnam, and so it's not defined by nationality at all. It is within the race, but it's a much, much smaller category than race. But they have this shared common ancestry, the shared history, historical memory, and there's elements of the common culture. So whether it's religion, customs, usually language, you will usually have one language across an ethnic group. And then oftentimes there is links with a symbolic ancestral homeland. It may not necessarily be a physical place, but there's this idea of an original origin for this group. And overall, within an ethnic group, you're going to have a sense of solidarity. Ethnicity is a lot more central to people's identity, to your personal identity and your group identity often, than is your nationality or your race. But that depends on each person. For some Americans, they may consider American as their core identity, especially if you happen to be Caucasian. Maybe you don't relate anymore to your German or Irish or Italian ancestors. You just see yourself as American. But you don't like the term white and don't want to be this general concept of being white, but maybe American is what you want to go by. For other groups, perhaps you are Hmong, or perhaps you are African, and within African you're from a specific region within Nigeria, let's say, and you're from a specific tribe or people group. And so even if you live in American, you wouldn't be African American. I mean, if you came from Africa, you probably wouldn't identify with your average African American, and so your ethnicity would be much more from the people group that you came from, that you share history and you share language with. Other definitions of ethnicity are belonging to or deriving from the cultural, racial, religious, or linguistic traditions of a people or country. So it's saying an ethnic group will kind of share all of these, both culture, race, religion, and language. And just to see what Wikipedia says, because again, what is the current social thought? It's an ethnicity or an ethnic group is a socially defined category of people who identify with each other based on common ancestral, social, cultural, or national experience. So again, those common elements, but it's people self-identifying that they belong together. So as I talked about the different ethnicities, this is just within South Asia overall. So we see areas here, and again, this is an older map, and so what it's calling. So this map doesn't have national borders on it, but what we see are groups by language groups. And again, ethnic groups are often within a language group. So within the nation of India, we have these major language groups, but we know there's over 1,000 languages in India. So even within these language groups, it breaks down into a lot of smaller groups. And we see this across Asia. So ethnicity is this much smaller, often category than is either race or nationality, and often a lot more personal for people, depending on how long it's been since they or their ancestors have lived either in that location or closely tied with that group. Here's another example. We're just going to speed through a bunch here. Again, this is breaking down India into even smaller language groups. This is how it could look in Iran based on ethnic groups. So within the country, there's over 10 groups here that we see represented, and they cross borders, and they're often very distinct from each other. Some are kind of an island within larger groups, and this is where a lot of our tensions will come from, and civil unrest, things like that. In Southern Europe, this is how people groups are looking. And another interesting thing about this map is we see is that the colors that are striped are showing ethnic minorities. So who's a minority population within a larger majority? But it's a large minority group. So interesting there. Within Europe, this is dominant ethnic groups, at least traditionally, and where people have come from. Again, there's, of course, a lot of migration within Europe. Here it is, again, focusing on the minority groups within those larger, so we saw these larger ethnic groups. Who are the minority groups within that? Feel free to pause the video and look closer at this, or open up the PowerPoint and look more specifically, because these are really interesting. And then this is how it's broken down by language. It's not exactly the same as how the ethnic groups break down. And then this is a really fun one showing how those different language and people groups, in this case the Philippines, translates into some basic areas of culture like dress or overall economics and what is trade and what is practiced. And then this is a really fun one too, showing food, specifically bread, across India by different cultures and people groups and within specific states, actually. So culture has its effects. So let me go through a bit more of the details of the course. That was our summary of race, ethnicity, nationality. If you have questions, please post them for me. I'd love to go through them. So these are the modules we're going to be going through in the course. Tonight was Introduction to Health Disparities, and then we'll be looking at the different determinants of health over the next few weeks, individual, social, and environmental. After that, we're going to spend 2 weeks just looking at culture and health beliefs and how that relates to health outcomes and health disparities that we see between groups. 7 and 8, we're going to focus on health care disparities. What are both inherent biases within the system, as well as different patient-provider interactions and disparities that happen in that. In Module 9, we're going to be looking at cross-cultural communication and health literacy. These are key concepts to understanding how to address a lot of these disparities. And then in Module 10, we'll just really sit on this topic of cultural competency and health disparities, how to be culturally competent within our profession. Your major assignments are posted here as well as on Canvas. There's the discussion board participation that happens weekly, and then the 4 other major assessments that we'll talk as we go through. There's no final exam for this course. It will be a lot of reading and writing and hopefully a lot of good discussion. Usually you miss out a lot online because you don't get the interaction in class, so really hoping we'll take advantage of the discussion board and have good conversations there, because you can only learn so much from the books. You really learn a lot from hearing different people's perspective, because as we saw in this module, so much of it is an individual is a social construct, and therefore it can't really be defined within a textbook or a reading. It's how grading works in the course. Typical breakdown for the letter grades. I want to stress late assignments do lose 20% per day. So please be aware of that when deciding when to turn in your assignments, and don't wait for the last minute. A lot of times the system gets bogged down the few minutes before something is due, so turn it in an hour ahead of time, or in the morning of the day it's due. And also final grades will be rounded to the nearest digit. I do tend to give partial points throughout the quarter, but the final grade will be rounded. But I don't curve grades, so that's a question that's come up. So in Module 1, in our discussion, the first thing I want everyone to do is introduce yourself. And when you introduce yourself, I want you to give as many of your demographics as you're comfortable with. So we talked about a number of ones: age, gender, religion, race, ethnicity, nationality. This is something I would encourage everyone to do, as this allows us to get a better perspective on each other's backgrounds. So personally, well, I'll give you the bracket. I'm in the 30 to 40 category, but my gender is female. My religion is Christian. I am white or Caucasian. For ethnicity, it's hard to really claim anything other than a white American, but I would love to say I'm Irish and Ukrainian, but nationality obviously is American. So that's a bit of my background as far as my demographics go. As far as program, I was a graduate of Loma Linda University. I got my MPH here in the Global Health Program, and so I'm really blessed to get to be a faculty now with the program. I've been working with the school for a few years on a number of grants, specifically around community resilience. And my background before this was working internationally in development settings. I spent a few years in Egypt. I've worked throughout the Middle East and Africa, and that was my background. And of course, a lot of that actually translates to here, and working a lot with LA County Public Health as well as Latino groups throughout the San Bernardino and Riverside counties. And so we see a lot of the same conditions and a lot of the same issues coming up. So that's what I focus on here. Feel free to give a bit of your employment or job history, or what you do outside of the program as well, to help us get a better understanding of who you are and where you come from. Something I want you to share as you introduce yourself is, did your view of any of your demographics change after watching the lecture? How so? What did you think you were before versus where might you be now? And then also, are your demographics different than what people might guess just by looking at you? So is your self-assigned categories different than what people would classify you as? So that's the introduction. I also want you to talk about, of the 3 categories for determinants of health, which do you think has the greatest impact on health? So that question that I raised earlier: individual, social, environmental. And then finally, which issue within health disparities are you most interested in? And this is where you can refer to your CDC report, please do, and talk about a specific health topic that you looked at, talk about what you found interesting in there. So for both of those, which category you looked at or for which issue, refer to your readings and bring up points that you found in there, and that'll help the discussion move along. So those posts are due by Thursdays at midnight. What you then need to do is respond to 2 of your peers by the following Sunday at midnight. You can do this before then, but I am asking that we limit it to 2 responses per post so that the responses get spread out, so that every student will have 2 responses to their post. So if a post has already been commented on twice, go on to one that has 0 or 1 post or responses to it. So ask questions, be respectful, of course, in everything that you say, but ask questions and dialogue or bring up other points that you want to talk about. By the following Thursday, I'm asking that you respond to your peers' questions. So your questions actually need to bring up something that your peer is expected to respond to, and I'm expecting you to actually go back and have a conversation with your peer. Again, I would love for it to go back and forth. Some of the best discussions will go back and forth 5, 10 times even as we're discussing issues, but at least 1 back and forth on each post is what I'm asking. Here's some further resources that I used for this lecture from Thomas Leviste. If you want to look at any of his books, if you want to rent them, or if you have them available, I do recommend them. So with that, send me an email if you have questions, or you can post it on the chat room for the Ask the Instructor, and I will look at that as well. And I look forward to reading your posts.